My stepfather kept joking at every funeral that I'd inherit nothing because I wasn't real family. He went pale when I revealed his family secret. The first time Rick said it, I was 14, and standing beside my great-uncle's casket. Rick leaned over and whispered loud enough for my cousins to hear that blood was thicker than water, and stepchildren shouldn't expect handouts from families they'd married into. My mother squeezed my shoulder and told me later that Rick was just being protective of our financial security, making sure I understood the realities of inheritance law. But it became his signature joke at every funeral. When Grandma Dorothy died, Rick announced during the reception that her will probably wouldn't mention me since I wasn't technically her granddaughter. At my step-grandfather's service, he made comments about how estate lawyers always prioritize biological connections over emotional ones. Each time, he'd follow up with a pat on my back and a reminder that I was lucky to have any family stability at all. The pattern continued for 8 years, through 11 different funerals. Rick seemed to relish these morbid occasions as opportunities to reinforce my outsider status within the family. He'd give speeches about bloodlines and heritage while I stood there feeling like an imposter wearing borrowed grief. My mother always defended him afterward, explaining that he'd grown up poor and understood the importance of protecting family assets. What struck me as odd was how Rick never shared his own family stories during these speeches about heritage and bloodlines. He had no childhood anecdotes, no tales of eccentric relatives, no family traditions he'd brought to our household. When pressed about his background, he'd deflect by saying the present family was all that mattered, and dwelling on the past was counterproductive to building a strong future together. The family found his mysterious past romantic and intriguing. My mother thought his reluctance to discuss his childhood showed depth and sensitivity about whatever trauma he'd experienced growing up. My aunts respected his focus on moving forward rather than wallowing in old wounds. Rick had successfully created an aura of dignified privacy while positioning himself as the authority on legitimate family connections. His frequent business trips added another layer of mystery that everyone accepted without question. Rick traveled constantly for work, disappearing for weeks at a time with vague explanations about client meetings and project deadlines. He worked in business consulting, he claimed, helping companies restructure their operations. The travel allowed him to command high fees and explained why he could afford to support our family so comfortably. My mother defended his absences as evidence of his dedication to providing for us financially. When relatives questioned why he missed so many family events, Rick would redirect by making jokes about modern families and how stepchildren should be grateful for any stability they received from non-biological parents. His pattern of absence became normalized as the price of financial security. The expensive gifts Rick brought from his business trips were always perfectly chosen to demonstrate both his financial success and his thoughtfulness. Designer clothes for my mother, electronics for me, luxury items that suggested he'd spent considerable time and money selecting them. He'd present these gifts with elaborate stories about finding them in exclusive boutiques or having them specially ordered from distant cities. I began to notice patterns in Rick's travel schedule that didn't quite make sense for legitimate business consulting. He'd disappear for exactly 2 weeks at a time, then return for precisely 10 days before leaving again. His destinations seemed to rotate through a limited number of cities, primarily Denver, Phoenix, and Portland. When I asked about the repetitive nature of his routes, Rick explained that he maintained long-term contracts with major clients in those markets. The first crack in Rick's facade appeared when I was 22 and helping my mother organize tax documents for their accountant. While sorting through Social Security statements and employment records, I noticed inconsistencies in Rick's documentation. His Social Security number seemed to have been issued much later than it should have been for someone his age, and his employment history only went back to 1998. Curious about these discrepancies, I began researching public records online during my lunch breaks at work. What I discovered made my hands shake as I scrolled through database after database. Richard Montgomery didn't exist in any official capacity before 1998. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history, no military service. It was as if he'd materialized from nothing 25 years ago. Digging deeper through archived newspaper articles and court records, I found references to a Robert Phillips who'd been wanted for embezzling $180,000 from a construction company in Nevada before disappearing without a trace in early 1998. The physical description matched Rick perfectly, down to the distinctive scar on his left hand from what he'd always claimed was a childhood accident with a broken window. The photograph in the old newspaper article took my breath away. It was unmistakably Rick, though 25 years younger and wearing a different expression. This version looked desperate and cornered, nothing like the confident man who'd spent decades lecturing me about family legitimacy. The article mentioned that Robert Phillips had a wife and 2 young children who'd been left destitute when he vanished with the embezzled funds. I spent weeks verifying the information, cross-referencing dates and details until I was certain of the connection. Rick Montgomery was Robert Phillips, a criminal who'd abandoned his family and assumed a false identity to escape prosecution. The man who'd spent years telling me I wasn't real family had been living a complete lie about his own identity and abandoning his actual biological children in the process. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Robert Phillips hadn't just embezzled money from his employer. He'd also taken out multiple credit cards and loans in his wife's name before disappearing, leaving her with crushing debt and no way to support their children. Court documents showed she'd filed for bankruptcy and lost their house within 6 months of his disappearance. My hands trembled as I printed copies of every document, every article, every piece of evidence I'd uncovered. The man who'd spent decades making me feel like an illegitimate addition to the family had built his entire life on illegitimacy. Every joke about bloodlines and inheritance, every speech about authentic family connections had been delivered by someone who'd abandoned his own authentic family for money. The investigation led me to social media profiles and recent news articles about Robert Phillips's original family. His ex-wife, now named Linda Kowalski, had remarried and rebuilt her life in Reno. She'd become a successful real estate agent and advocate for families of embezzlement victims. Her children, now adults, had both graduated college and started their own families, completely unaware that their biological father was living under a false identity just 3 states away. I found Linda's contact information through her real estate website and spent days crafting an email that would explain the situation without causing unnecessary trauma. When I finally sent it, including copies of the evidence I'd gathered, she responded within hours with a phone call that lasted 3 hours and changed everything I thought I knew about Rick's motivations and methods. Linda's voice shook as she described the months leading up to Robert's disappearance. He'd become increasingly paranoid about money, constantly talking about people who were trying to take advantage of the family and steal what they'd worked for. He'd isolated her from friends and relatives, claiming they were jealous of their success and couldn't be trusted with family business. The same manipulation tactics he'd used on my mother, refined over decades of practice. She revealed that Robert had been pressuring her to take out life insurance policies on herself and the children, claiming it was necessary to protect their future if anything happened to him. When she'd refused, he'd become violent for the first time in their marriage, leaving bruises on her arms that she'd hidden from everyone. The escalation had terrified her, but she'd been planning to leave when he vanished with the money. Linda's description of Robert's behavior in those final months painted a picture of someone preparing for a major deception. He'd been asking detailed questions about her family's financial history, copying important documents, and encouraging her to put more assets in joint accounts. He'd been methodically positioning himself to cause maximum damage when he disappeared, just as he'd later positioned himself to control and manipulate my mother. The timing felt significant when I received a call intended for Rick while he was away on another business trip. The woman on the other end was crying so hard she could barely speak, asking when Daddy would be home because their daughter needed emergency surgery. When I explained that Rick wasn't my biological father and I was his stepdaughter, the woman went completely silent for nearly 30 seconds. Her name was Patricia, and she'd been married to Rick for 15 years under his current identity. They had 3 children together, ages 12, 10, and 8. Rick had convinced her that his previous marriage had ended tragically when his first wife and children died in a car accident, which explained why he never talked about his past. He traveled constantly for work, he'd told her, to provide for their growing family. The phone call lasted 3 hours as Patricia and I compared notes about Rick's behavior patterns, his stories, his absences. She lived in Colorado and believed Rick worked primarily on the East Coast, which explained his frequent travel. I lived in Virginia and believed he worked primarily in the Western states. Between the two of us, Rick had created a perfectly balanced schedule of deception that allowed him to maintain 2 complete families. Patricia revealed details that made my stomach turn. Rick had used the same stories with both families, claiming the same childhood traumas, the same business connections, even the same preferences and personality quirks. He'd been performing the same character in 2 different locations for over a decade, traveling between identities like an actor switching between roles in different productions. The most disturbing part was learning about Rick's treatment of Patricia's children. Just as he'd positioned me as an outsider in our family, he'd been telling Patricia's kids that they weren't as important as his other obligations and that they shouldn't expect inheritance or long-term security. He'd been psychologically manipulating children in both families while maintaining the pretense of being a devoted father figure. Patricia and I agreed to meet in person to compare documentation and plan our next steps. She drove from Colorado to Virginia with copies of marriage certificates, birth certificates, and financial records that painted a complete picture of Rick's double life. The man had been systematically defrauding 2 families while positioning himself as a moral authority on family legitimacy and financial responsibility. The meeting with Patricia felt surreal, like looking into a mirror that reflected a slightly different version of my own experience. She showed me photos of Rick with her children, and his face wore the same expression of calculated warmth that I remembered from my own childhood. He'd been performing fatherhood rather than living it, treating both families as elaborate long-term cons rather than genuine relationships. We discovered that Rick had been using similar manipulation tactics with both families' extended relatives, creating networks of people who defended his behavior and enabled his deception. Patricia's family had been told that Rick's stepchildren from his previous marriage were ungrateful and demanding, just as my family had been told that his work required extensive travel and sacrifice for our benefit. The financial records Patricia brought painted a picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond bigamy. Rick had been using his dual identities to obtain credit cards, loans, and business licenses in multiple states. He'd created fake references and employment histories for each identity, building a house of cards that generated substantial income through various schemes while keeping both families financially dependent on his supposed generosity. Patricia revealed that Rick had recently been pressuring her to take out a large life insurance policy on herself, claiming it was necessary to protect the children's future. When she'd hesitated, he'd become angry and accused her of not trusting their marriage or caring about their children's security, the same manipulation tactics he'd used on my mother for years, creating guilt and obligation where genuine love should have existed. Through Patricia's financial records, we discovered that Rick had been running what amounted to a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using both families as unwitting participants. He'd been taking loans and credit advances in Colorado to fund his lifestyle in Virginia, while using Virginia assets as collateral for investments in Colorado. Both families were supporting a financial structure that would inevitably collapse, leaving everyone bankrupt except Rick himself. The investigation revealed that Rick's business consulting company was entirely fictional. The office address he'd given both families belonged to a mail forwarding service that accepted packages and calls on behalf of multiple fake businesses. His supposed clients were shell companies he'd created using stolen social security numbers and fake business licenses. The entire operation was designed to launder money and create the appearance of legitimate income. Patricia and I spent days documenting the full scope of Rick's criminal enterprise. We found evidence of identity theft, mail fraud, tax evasion, and forgery in addition to the bigamy and embezzlement charges. The man who'd spent decades lecturing about family legitimacy had been running one of the most elaborate fraud schemes either of us had ever encountered, all while maintaining the facade of being a devoted husband and father to multiple families. The plan we developed was simple, but devastating. Patricia would return to Colorado and continue acting normally, while I prepared for Rick's next appearance at a family gathering. We'd coordinate our timing to expose his deception simultaneously in both locations, preventing him from escaping to his alternate identity when the truth emerged. The upcoming funeral for my mother's sister provided the perfect opportunity. We also contacted Linda in Nevada, who agreed to cooperate with law enforcement and provide testimony about Robert Phillips's original crimes. She'd kept extensive documentation of the financial devastation he'd caused her family, including bank statements, bankruptcy filings, and police reports. Her evidence would help establish the pattern of behavior that connected all of Rick's criminal activities across multiple decades. Linda revealed that she'd actually been investigating Robert's whereabouts for years, not for revenge, but to ensure her children's safety. She'd discovered several other women who'd been victimized by men matching Robert's description and suspected he was still operating under false identities. Our contact finally gave her the evidence she needed to pursue formal charges and protect other potential victims. Rick's return from his latest business trip followed his usual pattern. He brought expensive gifts that demonstrated his financial success, shared carefully edited stories about his professional adventures, and immediately began reinforcing his position as head of household through subtle dominance displays. He asked about family news and upcoming events with the same calculated interest he'd probably shown Patricia's family. When I mentioned Aunt Caroline's funeral scheduled for the following Saturday, Rick's expression shifted to his familiar funeral persona. He began making his usual comments about inheritance and family legitimacy, warming up his material about bloodlines and authentic connections. The irony was so thick it made me physically nauseous, watching this fraud prepare to lecture grieving relatives about family authenticity. The week leading up to the funeral, Rick seemed more agitated than usual. He made several mysterious phone calls that he took in private, and I caught him reviewing what looked like financial documents late at night. When I asked about his apparent stress, he blamed upcoming business deadlines and the pressure of managing multiple client relationships simultaneously. I wondered if he sensed that his elaborate deception was finally beginning to unravel. Patricia called me 3 times during that week to coordinate our plan and share additional discoveries she'd made while investigating Rick's Colorado activities. She'd found evidence that Rick had been stealing from her children's college savings accounts to fund his Virginia lifestyle, just as he'd been using Virginia assets to support his Colorado family. The scope of his financial manipulation was staggering. The funeral arrived on a gray October morning with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything feel heavier and more somber. Aunt Caroline had been genuinely beloved by our extended family, and the church was packed with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Rick worked the crowd with his usual charm, positioning himself as a pillar of family stability, while making subtle digs about non-biological relationships. During the reception at the church hall, Rick stood up to give his traditional speech about family heritage and the importance of honoring authentic connections. He talked about how Aunt Caroline had understood that blood was thicker than water, how she'd always prioritized her real relatives over the various hangers-on who tried to claim family status through marriage or adoption. The familiar sick feeling returned to my stomach as I listened to this performance. Rick's voice grew more confident as he warmed to his theme, discussing how modern families had lost sight of what really mattered, how inheritance and legacy should flow through legitimate bloodlines rather than being diluted by artificial relationships. Several relatives nodded appreciatively, caught up in his rhetoric about family values and traditional connections. He looked directly at me while making his final point about outsiders learning to be grateful for whatever acceptance they received. That's when I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady as I asked Rick if I could add some thoughts about authenticity and family legitimacy. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Rick looked surprised but nodded, probably expecting me to deliver some weak attempt at defending my position in the family hierarchy that would only reinforce his narrative. I thanked everyone for coming to honor Aunt Caroline's memory and said that Rick was absolutely right about the importance of authenticity in family relationships. I mentioned that I'd recently learned something fascinating about authentic identity and the courage it takes to live honestly with the people you claim to love. Rick's confident expression began to falter as he sensed something different in my tone. I continued by saying that I'd discovered some interesting information about authentic family connections during my recent research into genealogy and public records. I explained how easy it was to trace someone's real identity through online databases, how employment histories and social security records could reveal the truth about a person's background and character. Rick's face went completely white as he realized where this was heading. I pulled out my phone and began reading from the newspaper articles I'd saved, describing how Robert Phillips had embezzled nearly $200,000 from his employer. Before abandoning his wife and 2 young children in Nevada, I explained how he'd disappeared completely in 1998, leaving his family destitute and his victims without recourse, before somehow acquiring a new identity and starting fresh with unsuspecting new victims. The room erupted in confused murmurs as relatives tried to process what they were hearing. Rick tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued speaking in the same calm tone that had held everyone's attention. I described how Robert Phillips, now calling himself Rick Montgomery, had spent 25 years lecturing other people about family legitimacy while living under a completely false identity. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out my second phone and dialed Patricia's number, putting the call on speaker as her voice filled the church hall. She introduced herself as Rick's wife of 15 years and the mother of his 3 children in Colorado. The gasps from my relatives were audible as Patricia described Rick's double life, his manipulation of both families, his pattern of psychological abuse disguised as moral authority. Patricia's voice cracked with emotion as she described how Rick had convinced her that his previous family had died tragically, how he'd used that fabricated grief to justify his secretiveness and frequent absences. She talked about their children asking why Daddy was never home for important events, how Rick had trained them to be grateful for whatever attention he provided rather than expecting consistent love and support. I added Linda's voice to the call, our third phone connecting Rick's original victim to his current ones. Linda identified herself as Robert Phillips' first wife and described the devastation he'd caused when he abandoned their family 25 years ago. She detailed the financial ruin, the emotional trauma, and the years of rebuilding their lives while he'd been creating new identities and new victims. Rick sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of panic, rage, and calculation, as he tried to find some way to salvage the situation. Several male relatives had moved to block the exits, sensing that Rick might try to run. My mother sat staring at her husband of 12 years, watching her entire marriage revealed as an elaborate fraud performed by a career criminal. I concluded by explaining that Patricia, Linda, and I had been working together to document Rick's crimes and prepare evidence for law enforcement. We'd discovered financial fraud, bigamy, identity theft, abandonment charges, and a sophisticated money laundering operation that would likely result in significant federal prison time. The man who'd spent decades telling me I wasn't real family had been fake from the very beginning. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Uncle David, who worked in law enforcement, called 911 while keeping Rick under surveillance. Other relatives began sharing stories about Rick's behavior that made more sense in context, warning signs they'd dismissed because his manipulation had been so skillful. My mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing as the full scope of her husband's deception became clear. Rick made one last attempt at manipulation, standing up to claim that Patricia, Linda, and I were conspiring against him out of jealousy and greed. He accused us of fabricating evidence to destroy a good man who'd only tried to provide for his families, but his performance fell flat now that everyone understood his true nature. The charm that had protected him for decades evaporated under the weight of documented evidence. The police arrived within 20 minutes, and Rick was arrested on outstanding warrants that had never been dismissed. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with pure hatred. Finally dropping the mask he'd worn for so long, I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only relief that his victims would finally get justice and protection from his manipulation. Patricia arrived from Colorado the next day to help sort through the wreckage of Rick's deception. The financial investigation revealed multiple bank accounts, credit cards, and business entities that Rick had used to funnel money between his two identities. Both families had been supporting his criminal enterprise while believing they were benefiting from his legitimate success. Linda flew in from Nevada with boxes of documentation spanning 25 years of searching for her ex-husband. She'd kept meticulous records of every lead, every false identity, every victim she'd discovered during her investigation. Her persistence had created a paper trail that connected Robert Phillips to Rick Montgomery and dozens of other criminal activities across multiple states. The FBI took over the case when they realized the scope of Rick's operation extended across state lines and involved federal crimes including mail fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Special Agent Catherine Reeves explained that Rick's scheme was one of the most sophisticated long-term fraud operations they'd encountered, involving multiple fake identities and elaborate financial structures designed to avoid detection. The legal proceedings took months to unravel, with charges filed in multiple states for bigamy, identity theft, financial fraud, and abandonment. Rick's defense attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was overwhelming and the victims numerous. The construction company he'd originally embezzled from was still seeking restitution, and both Patricia and my mother had grounds for civil suits. The psychological impact on both families was devastating. Patricia's children struggled to understand why their father had been living a lie, while my mother entered intensive therapy to process the trauma of discovering that her entire marriage had been based on deception. Extended relatives dealt with guilt about enabling Rick's behavior and shame about being fooled by his manipulation. But there were unexpected positive outcomes as well. Patricia and I developed a genuine friendship based on our shared experience of surviving Rick's manipulation. Her children and I became connected as step-siblings who'd both been victimized by the same predator. My mother, once she processed the initial shock, felt relief at finally understanding why her marriage had always felt performative rather than authentic. Linda became our unofficial leader in navigating the legal system and connecting with other victims of Rick's crimes. Through her advocacy work, we discovered that Rick had attempted similar schemes with at least 3 other women over the past decade, though none of those relationships had progressed as far as his arrangements with Patricia and my mother. The trial lasted 6 weeks and resulted in Rick receiving a 25-year sentence for multiple federal felonies. During the victim impact statements, Patricia, Linda, my mother, and I all described the psychological damage caused by his systematic manipulation and abandonment. Patricia's older daughter, now 16, spoke about growing up feeling like she wasn't good enough to deserve her father's consistent presence and love. The judge noted that Rick had shown no remorse throughout the proceedings, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence and continuing to blame his victims for his exposure. The sentence reflected not just the financial crimes but the emotional devastation he'd caused to multiple families over decades of calculated deception. Rick's assets were seized to provide restitution to his victims, but the financial recovery was minimal since most of the money had been spent maintaining his elaborate double life. The psychological recovery proved more valuable than any monetary compensation, as all of his victims found healing through support groups and therapy, designed specifically for families affected by long-term deception. 2 years later, Patricia and her children moved to Virginia to be closer to our extended family. The kids integrated into our family gatherings naturally, finally experiencing the authentic connections that Rick had always prevented them from having. They called my mother Grandma and treated me like the big sister I'd never been allowed to be during Rick's manipulation. My mother eventually remarried a man named Thomas, who'd been widowed for several years, and understood the complexity of blended families. He never made jokes about inheritance or legitimacy, never positioned himself as the authority on family connections. Instead, he asked questions about our traditions, and worked to understand how he could contribute to, rather than control our family dynamic. The inheritance issue that Rick had used to torment me for years resolved itself naturally when various relatives updated their wills to include Patricia's children alongside me as beneficiaries. No one questioned their legitimacy or made distinctions between biological and chosen family connections. Rick's obsession with bloodlines had been revealed as the projection of someone who'd abandoned his own blood for personal gain. Linda remarried as well, to a man who'd also been victimized by financial fraud and understood the long road to rebuilding trust. She continued her advocacy work, helping law enforcement identify and prosecute similar schemes while supporting other families affected by long-term deception and abandonment. At the most recent family funeral for my step-grandmother, I gave a speech about authentic family connections and the difference between people who earn their place through love and those who demand it through manipulation. Patricia's youngest son sat in the front row wearing his first funeral suit, holding hands with my mother while tears streamed down his face for a woman who'd welcomed him unconditionally in the 2 years they'd known each other. The healing process continued slowly but steadily, with therapy helping all of us understand how Rick's manipulation had affected our relationships with each other and ourselves. We learned to recognize the signs of emotional abuse disguised as moral authority, the way predators use shame and obligation to control their victims. Most importantly, we discovered what authentic family connection actually felt like when built on truth rather than lies. Rick remains in prison with 17 years left on his sentence, though he'll face additional charges when he's released since Patricia's and my mother's civil suits are still pending. He sends occasional letters claiming to have found religion and requesting forgiveness, but none of us respond. Some fractures run too deep for healing, especially when caused by someone who spent decades deliberately inflicting damage while pretending to provide protection. The final irony came when we discovered that Rick's original family in Nevada had also rebuilt their lives after his abandonment. His first wife, Linda, had remarried, and his biological children had been adopted by their stepfather, taking his name and finding the stability Rick had stolen from them. They were thriving without him, just as we were learning to thrive without his toxic influence. The man who'd obsessed over legitimate family connections had been erased from 4 different families' lives, leaving no authentic legacy except the damage he'd caused and the strength his victims had found in surviving him. The inheritance he'd always claimed would never be mine became irrelevant compared to the family bonds we'd built through shared truth, mutual support, and the kind of authentic love that can't be faked or stolen.